I talked in the past about some of my family's personal experience with Padre Pio. Tonight I'm going to talk about his teachings, about the shadow side of spirituality. So this is one of his most important teachings, and it concerns a vice that is probably the most subtle of vices and the least well understood, the least talked about. It's an unusual vice in that it only affects good people, people who are on an intentional spiritual journey, people who are trying to purify their hearts. It's also unusual in that people who fall prey to it are seldom aware that it's happening. And once they're aware that it's happening, they pull out of it. This is not the case with other vices. You can imagine someone who's being proud or jealous or angry or vengeful and being aware, very much aware that they're being that way and persisting with the behavior. Padre Pio compares this vice to the human shadow. He says, our shadow follows us everywhere and even marks our steps. If we run, it runs too. If we proceed at a slow pace, the shadow does likely. And he says this shadow follows virtue everywhere. Just as it would be useless for the body to try to escape from its own shadow, so too for virtue. It's not possible to run away from this vice. He says, the more someone flees from the shadow, the more they are beset by it. And before going further, I want to acknowledge that I have some skin in the game. I fell prey to this vice in a significant way many years ago, and it did me great harm. I had a friend at the time who was frustrated with my religious poetry, and he said, why don't you write about the shadow side of spirituality? And I didn't write about it because I didn't see it, even as it was undermining me. So somewhere out there, my friend can be saying, I told you so, and it took you long enough. So while I didn't know what was going on, at some point, I got a sense that there was something wrong. And I was able to pull out of it, but not understanding the nature of it, I wasn't sure that I could protect myself from it in the future. And it opened up this chasm of fear in me for 20 years. And while I still had access to my faith, and sometimes in very deep and powerful ways, I was unable to enter the deeper forms of prayer because I didn't trust myself there. And it wasn't until, by God's grace, I was given Padre Pio as my spiritual father, which is 7 years ago now, that I finally understood. And I'm sharing what I've learned from him tonight in the hopes that others don't need to have as steep a learning curve as I had. So the vice that he's talking about is vainglory, and specifically vainglory in a spiritual context. He quotes St. John Chrysostom, a 4th century church father, about the paradoxical nature of this vice. Chrysostom says, every evil is born of evil. Only vainglory proceeds from good. And it cannot therefore be extinguished by good, but on the contrary, it is increased. And how is that possible? Padre Pio provides a clue in his letter to his spiritual director, Padre Agostino. He says that the devil knows very well that a man who is lusty or greedy or avaricious has more reason to be confused and blush about his behavior than to glory in it. But if he doesn't tempt these people on that matter, he does not spare good people, especially those who are seeking a way of perfection. Padre Pio goes on to say that all the other vices hold sway only with people who allow themselves to be vanquished by them. Vainglory goes after people who defeat it. And it goes after them even stronger after their victories. Why would a victory over vainglory trigger a fresh attack? St. John Cassian, another 4th century church father, has a passage that's very similar to the one from Padre Pio that I just quoted. He says, the more thoroughly vainglory has been resisted, the more vigorously does it attack the person who is elated by his victory over it. And elated is the key word here. Every authentic victory, and no matter what area you're doing, comes with a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. And after a victory, we also need to just let our breath out, let our guard down a little bit and process before moving on to the next task. And I think that what Padre Pio and Cassian are saying is that in this natural and unavoidable response, we provide a weakness. By letting our guard down, we provide a fresh area for it to attack. So what is it in particular? You probably haven't heard of the 8 evil thoughts. They were first articulated by Evagrius the Solitary in the 4th century. And he listed vainglory along with the 7 other vices that are most well known. 200 years later, Pope Gregory I came along and he formulated the 7 deadly sins, and he eliminated vainglory from that category and folded it into fear. And that is, it's unfortunate in some ways, because being aware of vainglory and being aware of how it operates is one of the best ways that we can protect ourselves. So what's the difference between these 2 forms of pride? Pride is an excessive belief in one's abilities or in one's importance. Vainglory is a form of pride driven by an excessive desire for admiration and praise. Padre Pio calls vainglory the consuming moth of devout souls. And the metaphor is telling, particularly for people who have a few years on them, where it's at this time of year you would open up the closet and find the woolen sweaters riddled with holes. This is how vainglory operates. It operates in hidden corners, in the shadows. It operates in the areas of ourselves that we tend to overlook. Padre Pio warns, you must watch out for this vice all the more, since it is easier for it to enter the soul unobserved. And he tells his spiritual daughter, Raphaelina, that vainglory leads us, without our being aware of it, to appear somewhat above others and to gain the esteem of all. Padre Pio says vainglory is especially to be feared because, unlike all the other vices, there is no virtue that we can cultivate to combat it. So he says that anger is demolished by weakness, and envy by charity, and pride by humility. Vainglory has no contrary virtue. Some people would have argued that humility is the contrary virtue, and that's true in a sense. Since vainglory is a form of pride, one couldn't begin to combat it without cultivating a sense of humility. But what Padre Pio tells us is that humility is not enough. And he says, vainglory seeps into the holiest of acts, and even into humility itself, if one is not watchful. And we know that he's right about that. Imagine someone you know, or a saint even, who you respect and as a very humble person. And that person starts to become aware that people think of them as humble and starts to feel just a little bit too good about it. And in that moment, the person is no longer humble. They're taking a secret pride in the virtue of humility. What is it that makes devout people especially vulnerable to it? I think it relates in parts to the awesome nature of the gifts that God gives people who are on an intentional journey towards him. And what are these gifts? Our patron St. Paul lists them in that famous passage in Corinthians: wisdom, knowledge, faith, love, charity, prophecy, the gifts of healing, discernment of spirits, the working of miracles. Some of these are pretty heady, and others of them, with grace, are accessible to all of us in the room. But how do these gifts relate to vainglory? It's not so much the gifts themselves, but it's the challenge of absorbing them into our fallen natures. So Padre Pio, for example, he had all of the gifts that St. Paul talks about, and many more. And yet he apparently struggled with this issue for his entire life. The letters that he wrote to his spiritual father, he was only in his mid-20s at the time. But one of his spiritual sons, Adolfo Afado, was with him in his room towards the end of his life. And Father Eusebio was changing the bandages on Padre Pio's stigmata on his foot and winced. And Adolfo said, "Does it hurt?" And Padre Pio said, "Only I know how much it hurts. Yet the Lord permits it so that I do not become too proud of the gifts that I've been given, and to remind me of my human nature." So the giving of the gifts expands us, and there's the danger in receiving them that we can be puffed up a little bit. St. Paul, of course, had an abundance of gifts also. He most well known, he had an experience, a conversion experience of the risen Christ on the road to Damascus. But we should also bear in mind that St. Paul, who was regarded as the first Christian theologian, he got all of his theology as a direct revelation from God. He did not get it through consultations with the apostles. Many of us are familiar with St. Paul's expression, "I am weak, therefore I am strong." And this relates to some unknown affliction that he suffered with for most of his life. And 3 times he asked God if he could take that from him. And God's answer was, "My grace is sufficient for you, because power is made perfect in weakness." But notice what St. Paul says a little earlier in that passage about why he has the weakness, and how closely it aligns with what Padre Pio said and what Cassian said earlier. "To keep me from becoming too elated by the abundance of revelations, a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming too elated." One of the most blatant and head-scratching examples of vainglory in the Bible comes at the Last Supper, of all places. Jesus has just given the disciples his body and blood, and he's told them one last time about what's to come. And what's the next thing that happens? There the apostles are arguing among themselves about which of them is the greatest. And so after receiving what is effectively the first communion from Jesus himself, their response was to think about their own glory in being participants in the Last Supper, rather than focusing on the glory of God, which had just been revealed to them in such a dramatic way.